Amos Kincaid lay in the narrow prison bunk, listening to the measured breathing of his cellmate. The bruise under his left eye from 3 days ago still ached every time he blinked. His ribs ached with a dull ache, a consequence of his preventive talk with Warden Laurel Ransom last week. The 40-year-old man had long ago stopped marveling at how quickly a man could get used to pain, get used to it, but not accept it. Outside his cell window, dawn was beginning to break over the Richmond Correctional Institution in Virginia. It was still a half hour before rising, but Amos couldn't sleep. Sleep had been leaving him more often in recent months, ever since his life had become a daily survival. He turned carefully on his side, trying not to wake Silas Drayton, and tried to find a position where his body would hurt less. 6 months ago, when Amos had first gone to prison for burglary, he had still hoped to serve his 3-year sentence quietly and without too much trouble. His lawyer had promised that with good behavior he could expect to be released early in 2 years. Working in the prison laundry seemed quite tolerable. He had always been good with washing machines, and the physical labor helped him not think about how much he missed his little sister Clara. Cellmate Silas Drayton also seemed lucky at first. The 45-year-old man was here for credit card fraud, a relatively mild crime by prison standards. He had a quiet personality, didn't snore at night, and didn't try to establish any sort of hierarchy in their small cell. The first few weeks passed without much incident. That changed when the warden, Laurel Ransom, chose Amos as her target. Ransom was a woman of medium height with hard features and ice-cold brown eyes. In her 35 years, she had worked in the prison system for 8 years and had earned a reputation as a tough but effective officer. Ransom had a distinctive manner. She always walked with a straight back, slow and measured, like a predator stalking its prey. Her uniform was always impeccably pressed, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and her baton hung on her belt so that every prisoner could see it and remember the consequences of disobedience. But most frightening of all were her eyes. There was not a shred of humanity in them, only cold contempt for everyone on the other side of the bars. The first time Ransom noticed Amos was a month after his arrival. It was an ordinary morning, the inmates lining up for roll call before the workday began. Amos was standing in his row, trying to be inconspicuous as always, when he heard a familiar harsh voice. "Kincaid, why are you poking around like an old woman?" Amos didn't understand what was the matter. He stood in line at the same time as everyone else, not pushing or interfering with anyone. But Ransom was already coming toward him, and it was clear from the look on her face that she wasn't interested in explanations. "When I say line up, I mean line up fast," she hissed, stopping in front of him. "Not waddle like a sick man." The baton struck him in the stomach, causing Amos to crouch in pain and shortness of breath. He tried to straighten up, but his breath caught, and he clutched his stomach. "You're making theater too," Ransom added, leaning in close to his ear. "Remember once and for all, Kincaid, when I give a command, you follow it instantly. No delay, no deliberation, no why. Understand?" Amos nodded, still trying to catch his breath. The other prisoners stood silent, averting their gazes. No one wanted to draw the attention of the enraged warden. From that day on, the abuse became a regular occurrence, as if Ransom sensed something in Amos that made her hate him. At first, it was the random jolts in the hallway. Ransom would walk past Amos and as if unintentionally hit him with her shoulder, but with such force that he would hit the wall. If he tried to resent her or even look at her with bewilderment, he was immediately punished for impertinent behavior. Then the picking on his work began. Amos worked diligently in the laundry. He realized that good grades could help him get an early release, but Ransom found faults in every little thing. The laundry wasn't clean enough, or he folded the sheets at the wrong angle, or he worked too slowly, or he was in too much of a hurry and might ruin something. "Do you think this place is a resort, Kincaid?" she'd ask him when she caught him working in the laundry room. "Do you think you can work with your sleeves up?" Amos would start to explain that he was doing the right thing, but that only annoyed her more. "You gonna argue with me?" Followed by a clubbing on the back or the hands. Gradually, the physical abuse was supplemented by psychological abuse. Ransom deprived him of his right to make a weekly phone call to his sister, the only link to the outside world that kept him from going mad. She would intercept and not pass on letters from Clara, and when Amos asked about them, she claimed there were no letters. "I guess your sister has decided to forget about you," she said with a cold chuckle. "I'm not surprised. Who needs a criminal brother?" These words hurt Amos more than physical blows. He knew that Clara loved him and would never leave him, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. In particularly difficult moments, he began to think, what if Ransom was right? What if his little sister was really tired of the problems he was causing her? Ransom also made unscheduled searches of their cell, always while Amos was at work. Ransom especially liked to pick on Amos when she worked in the laundry room. She'd show up unannounced, usually at the most inopportune moments when he was sorting out dirty laundry or hanging laundry. She found far-fetched infractions and punished them with sadistic pleasure. Sometimes she made him rewash clean laundry, claiming it had stains that Amos had not seen. Sometimes she'd beat him for allegedly folding the sheets wrong, even though he did it exactly the same way he always did. And sometimes she just stood by and watched him work, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. "You know, Kincaid," she said at such times, tapping her baton slowly on her palm, "I don't think you have enough respect for me. I can see it in your eyes." Amos had learned to lower his gaze, but that didn't help either. "And now you're ignoring me? You think you can pretend I don't exist?" Any reaction from him became an excuse for punishment. Amos quickly realized that the real reasons for her rage didn't matter. Ransom simply enjoyed the pleasure of power over a defenseless man. The worst part was that no one intervened. The other wardens either looked away or pretended not to see anything. Some even chuckled as they watched Amos's humiliation. The prisoners were afraid of incurring Ransom's wrath by witnessing what was happening. The silencing system worked perfectly. An old prisoner, Marshall, who was on his second robbery conviction, once explained the rules of the game frankly to Amos. "Listen, kid," he said at lunchtime when they were sitting at the same table. "I've been here for years, and I've seen all kinds of wardens. Ransom's a psychopath, everybody knows that. But as long as she doesn't touch you, it's best to stay out of it. It's every man for himself." "But that's wrong," Amos tried to object. "She's overstepping her authority." "Right, wrong," Marshall grinned. "Where do you think you are? In a hotel? It's whoever's got the most power. She's got the baton and the support of her superiors." The only person who even tried to help was her cellmate Silas. In the evenings, when Amos returned to his cell with new bruises, the good-natured crook would silently give him a homemade cold compress made of a wet rag. Sometimes he shared headache pills he'd managed to get from an orderly he knew. "You should complain," Silas whispered in the darkness as they lay in their bunks after lights out. "This isn't right, Amos. It shouldn't be like this, not even here." "And who am I supposed to complain to?" Amos replied, turning carefully on his side so as not to disturb his sore ribs. "To the shift supervisor who knows exactly what's going on. A prison director who doesn't give a damn about the inmates? They're all in the same system, Silas." "What about the psychologist? Flintro seems like a normal woman. Maybe she can help." Julianne Flintro did seem different. The 38-year-old woman had been a prison psychologist for 5 years and had earned a reputation for fairness and understanding. She had soft manners, attentive brown eyes, and an ability to listen without judging. She had a knack for finding the right words and seemed to genuinely want to help people get better and get their lives back on track. Amos met with her twice a month as part of a mandatory psychological rehabilitation program. Their conversations took place in a small office on the second floor of the administration building, the only place in the prison where one could feel almost human. There were reproductions of paintings on the walls, a live potted violet on the desk, and the visitor's chair was soft and comfortable. Flintro definitely noticed the bruises and abrasions on Amos's face and arms. During their conversations, she cautiously questioned him about his well-being and how his relationships with other inmates and staff were going. Amos could see the concern in her eyes, but for a long time he hesitated to open up to her fully. "How are things going at work?" she asked, noticing the fresh bruise on his wrist. "Isn't it too hard?" "It's fine," Amos answered, instinctively covering the bruise with his sleeve. "It's just a job. Any trouble with the staff? You know, sometimes there are conflict situations. If something's going on, you can tell me." There was caution in her voice, but also a willingness to listen. Amos sensed that she knew more than she was saying, but hesitated to open up. Fear of Rance was stronger than the desire to find protection. Finally, after a particularly brutal beating, when Ransom broke 2 fingers on his left hand on the pretext that he was sloppy with the equipment, Amos dared to tell Flintro the truth. "Warden Ransom," he began, looking down at the floor. She beats me. All the time. For months now." Flintro fell silent. Amos looked up and saw that her face had become very serious, and there was something like fear in her eyes. "Amos," she said after a long pause, "I realize that life here is not easy, but sometimes it's best not to stir things up. Not all problems have easy solutions." "But there is something you can do, isn't there?" he insisted. "You're a psychologist. You have influence." "My influence is very limited," Flintro interrupted him. "There are some things I can't change, no matter how much I want to." Her voice sounded tired and cloaked with despair. Amos realized that even Flintro was afraid of Ransom, or the system of which the overseer was a part. The psychologist knew what was happening, had seen the results of the abuse, but was as powerless as he was. "Try to just get through this time," she added quietly. "Your time is not that long. The main thing is not to do anything that might make it longer." After that conversation, Amos felt completely alone. The only person who could help him actually advised him to keep quiet and be patient, but tolerating was getting harder every day. It was as if Ransom sensed his despair and enjoyed it. She invented new ways to humiliate him. She made him scrub the floor with his bare hands, locked him in the punishment cell for imaginary offenses, deprived him of hot food, and forced him to eat only bread and water. Sometimes, she would just walk up to him in the hallway and strike him for no reason, just because she was in a bad mood. "What are you looking at, Kincaid?" she'd ask after a sudden blow like that. "You got something to say?" Amos had learned to keep quiet, but silence also irritated him. "You think if you keep quiet like a fish, I'll leave you alone? You're wrong." After 4 months of constant abuse, Amos finally decided to file a formal complaint. He realized the risk, but he could no longer bear the daily humiliation. He wrote a detailed statement to the warden, describing all the incidents of abuse of authority by Ransom, the dates and circumstances of the most serious incidents. He gave the statement to Rogers, the warden on duty, who seemed fairer than the others. Amos asked that the complaint be kept confidential and not reported to Ransom until it had been formally reviewed. "Of course," Rogers assured him, stashing the document in a folder. Everything would be in accordance with the law. The answer came the next day, only not in the form of an official document or a summons, but in the form of a particularly brutal reprisal. Ransom showed up at the laundry room in the middle of the afternoon, when no one was there but Amos. In her hand, she held his statement. "Decided to complain, Kincaid?" she asked, slowly tearing the paper into small pieces. "Did you think someone would protect you? You thought there was justice here?" The beating lasted almost half an hour. Ransom beat methodically and calculatingly, choosing places where the bruises would be less visible to outsiders. She used not only a baton, but also a rubber tube, which she had brought specially for the occasion. After that incident, the bullying didn't just intensify. It became systematic and especially brutal. It was as if Ransom realized she could afford anything. Amos no longer tried to complain or seek protection. He just tried to survive from one day to the next. The physical pain was only part of the problem. Worse was the constant humiliation, the feeling of his own helplessness in the face of lawlessness. Amos could feel something inside him slowly breaking down under the weight of the daily abuse. He began to sleep worse, often waking from nightmares in which Ransom chased him down endless corridors. His appetite was almost gone, and he had lost a noticeable amount of weight. Any sudden sound made him flinch and look around for a threat. Silas watched his cellmate's changes with growing alarm. The good-natured rogue realized Amos was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but didn't know how to help him. Several times he tried to talk to the other prisoners, hoping to find allies, but they either dismissed him or told him to mind his own business. "Everyone here survives as best they can," Marshall explained to him. "Ransom's a rabid dog, but she's our rabid dog. As long as she spends her anger on 1 or 2 losers, the rest of us are better off. The only person who at least tried to confront what was going on was Flintrow. After her conversation with Amos, the psychologist had sent several requests to the administration asking to transfer him to another unit or change his workplace. She cited psychological problems related to adapting to prison life, but each time she received refusals on various pretexts. Flintrow realized she was working in a deeply corrupt system where staff violence had become an unofficial but accepted norm of inmate management. Complaints were not taken seriously, and attempts to protect prisoners' rights were perceived as creating problems for the administration. She saw Amos slowly crumbling under the pressure of constant abuse, but was powerless to help him. All she could do was continue to meet with him and try to support him psychologically, although she realized that this was woefully inadequate. During their last meeting before the tragic events, Flintrow had been particularly disturbed by Amos's condition. He looked haggard and thin, and there was something dangerous in his eyes, a mixture of despair and repressed rage. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "All right," Amos answered mechanically, but his hands were trembling. "Amos," she said gently, "there are times in a man's life when very difficult decisions have to be made. The important thing at such times is not to lose oneself completely. Don't do something you'll regret for the rest of your life." After failing to file a formal complaint, Amos Kincaid's life became a living hell. It was as if Laurel Ransom had shed the last masks of politeness and professionalism, openly displaying her power over the defenseless prisoner. The abuse had become a daily occurrence, and its brutality was beyond anything Amos could have imagined. Now she beat him not only for perceived infractions, but also just for her own pleasure. In the morning, passing by his cell on her rounds, she could bang her baton on the bars so hard that the metal rang over Amos's sleeping ear. In the daytime, when she met him in the corridor, she would push him into the wall or punch him in the stomach without giving a reason. In the evening, she'd walk into his cell on the pretense of checking on him and beat him right in front of a terrified Silas. "What are you looking at?" she'd throw to Amos's cellmate. "You want to join me?" Silas Drayton only turned his back to the wall, huddled in his bunk. He realized his powerlessness and hated himself for his cowardice, but the fear of being in Amos's shoes was stronger than his conscience. The punishments in the laundry room became especially subtle. Ransom went there almost every day, sometimes several times. She would make Amos re-wash clean laundry, then declare it dirty again. She could tip a basket of freshly washed sheets onto the dirty floor, then beat him for messing up government property. One day, she brought with her a brass knuckle, a homemade one made of metal rings. The blows began to leave deeper wounds, the bruises turning purple and lasting for weeks. Amos began to lose weight. Eating was becoming difficult because of the constant pain in his ribs and stomach. "You know, Kincaid," Ransom said, admiring her work, "I thought you'd break faster. But you turned out to be a tough nut to crack. It's kind of interesting." Ransom began telling other inmates made-up stories about Amos allegedly cooperating with the administration, ratting out those who broke the rules. This was especially dangerous in a prison environment where snitches were hated more than anyone else. "Did you hear the news?" she said loudly in the dining room, passing the table where Amos was sitting. "It turns out that we have a man who likes to snitch on his comrades. I wonder who it could be." Some of the prisoners began to look askance at Amos, shunned him. Marshall, who had at least said hello to him before, was now defiantly turning away. Amos realized it was another of Ransom's games, but it was impossible to explain anything to the other prisoners. They wouldn't believe him. Sleep had almost completely left Amos. At night, he lay on his bunk, listening to every rustle in the corridor, expecting that Ransom might come at any moment. By day, he walked like a fog, struggling to concentrate on his work. His hands shook, his appetite was gone, and the mirror reflected a haggard face with sunken eyes. Silas watched his cellmate's condition with growing horror. The good-natured rogue saw Amos slowly going insane from the constant stress and pain. At night, he often talked in his sleep, sometimes screaming, waking up in a cold sweat. "Amos, you can't go on like this," Silas whispered in the darkness of the cell. "You're falling apart. Should I ask to have you transferred to the infirmary?" "What am I going to tell the doctor?" Amos answered hoarsely. "That I'm being beaten by the warden?" He'd report it to the warden, and the warden would tell Ransom. It'll only get worse. But you could die, Silas persisted. Look at yourself in the mirror. Maybe it's better this way, Amos whispered, and the word scared Silas more than anything. Julianne Flintrow had noticed the catastrophic change in Amos's condition, too. During their last few meetings, he had looked like a living skeleton covered in skin. His eyes had lost all expression, his hands trembled constantly, his speech was slow and sluggish. Amos, the psychologist tried to get through to him, you must hold on. Your time is not infinite. There's only a year left. A year, he repeated blankly. A whole year. Flintrow realized that at this rate of destruction, Amos simply wouldn't live to be released. She sent several more requests to the administration, this time openly pointing out the prisoner's critical psychological condition and the need for immediate transfer. The responses were formal and negative. In mid-November, the prison began a planned reconstruction of one of the buildings. The roof of the old building required serious repairs. The roof was leaking, and in some places the beams were rotting. Prisoners from different units, including Amos, were recruited to carry out the work. Amos had once worked as a builder and had a knack for roofing. Despite his poor condition, he was assigned to an 8-man crew to replace damaged sections of the roof. The first 2 days were relatively quiet. The workers were supervised by Supervisor Rogers, the same supervisor who had promised to keep Amos's complaint secret. He was strict, but fair, and did not allow himself any unnecessary cruelty. Amos felt something like relief for the first time in months. The physical labor in the fresh air distracted him from his gloomy thoughts, and Ransom's absence allowed him to relax a little. He even began to eat with appetite, for the first time in a long time. But on Wednesday, Rogers fell ill and was replaced by Laurel Ransom. She showed up on the roof around 10 o'clock in the morning, when the crew had already had time to turn the job around. Seeing Amos among the other prisoners, she smiled that cold smile he knew and feared. "What high-rises we have here," she said, as she slowly made her way around the workers. "Kincaid, what are you doing here? Can you really be trusted with a job this important?" Amos remained silent, concentrating on replacing the damaged shingles. But the silence only irritated Ransom. "I'm talking to you," she raised her voice. "Or did you think you could ignore me at altitude?" "No, ma'am," Amos answered quietly, not raising his head. "I can't hear you." "No, ma'am," he repeated louder. Ransom came closer. They were standing at the edge of the roof, where there was no guardrail. There was a gaping patch of asphalt below. "You know, Kincaid," she said thoughtfully, "I think you're getting a little overconfident. Working at altitude, thinking you're a hero. Or maybe you think you can escape from here." "No, ma'am, I'm just doing my job." "Or maybe," Ransom continued, moving even closer, "you're thinking of pushing me? Yes, Kincaid? You want to get rid of me?" "No, ma'am," Amos whispered. Don't what?" she yelled. "You haven't thought about it? You're lying. I can see it in your eyes. You're dreaming of killing me." She grabbed him by his shirt and dragged him to the very edge of the roof. Amos felt the hard surface end beneath his feet. "Look down, Kincaid," Ransom shouted, pulling him to the edge. "See how high we are? One step and all your troubles will be over." Amos tried to pull back, but she held him tight, her face contorted with rage and some kind of morbid excitement. "You know what?" she said in a near whisper. "Maybe I should help you make up your mind." And she pushed him toward the abyss. Amos felt himself losing his balance. The edge of the roof was behind him, and there was no support under his feet. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. He saw Ransom's face contorted in a triumphant smile, heard the screams of the other prisoners, felt his body begin to fall backwards. The instinct for self-preservation was stronger than fear and months of humiliation. Amos swung his arms desperately, trying to find footing, and his right hand grabbed onto Ransom's. Before he had time to think, he pulled her toward him with all his might, trying to hold on and not fall. But Ransom hadn't expected such resistance. She lost her balance, and her own push backfired on her. Amos, balancing on the edge, pushed her off of herself with desperate force, trying to hold on to the roof. Laurel Ransom fell 4 stories to the asphalt pad. The sound of impact with the concrete echoed across the prison yard. For a few seconds there was dead silence on the roof. The prisoners froze, unable to believe what had just happened. Amos stood at the edge, breathing heavily and looking down at the motionless body of the warden. The first to regain consciousness was one of the workers, a prisoner named Davis. "My God," he whispered. "She's dead." Amos couldn't move. His hands trembled, his legs shook. He continued to look down where Laurel Ransom lay in an unnatural pose. A dark puddle was slowly spreading around her head. "Amos!" Davis called out to him. "Amos, get away from the edge!" From below came the shouts of guards, the sound of running feet, the barking of service dogs. One of the prisoners working in the yard had seen the fall and raised the alarm. "What happened?" asked a young prisoner named Michael, who was working in the far corner of the roof and could not see what was happening. "Ransom fell," Davis explained. "They had an argument and she fell." "Did she fall or was she pushed?" a third worker asked. No one answered. Everyone realized that either way, Amos was in trouble. In prison, the death of a warden, even one like Ransom, was considered the most serious crime. Other wardens were already coming up to the roof. The first to arrive was Assistant Warden Captain Brooks with his machine gun at the ready. "Everybody on the ground!" he yelled. "Hands on your heads!" The prisoners quickly lay down on the roof with their arms spread. Amos moved as if in a dream, still not fully aware of what was happening. "Who did this?" Brooks demanded answers. "Who pushed Officer Ransom?" There was a heavy silence. The prisoners lay silent, no one wanting to be the first to name names. "It was me," Amos said quietly. Brooks walked over to him and cuffed him. "Amos Kincaid, you are under arrest on suspicion of murdering a correctional officer," he said formally. "You have the right to remain silent." Amos didn't hear the rest of the words. His mind seemed to shut down, protecting itself from the shock. He let himself be led away from the roof, down the stairs, into the prison car. The only thing he remembered clearly from that day was Laurel Ransom's face as he fell. The expression of triumph was replaced by surprise, then horror as she realized she was losing her balance. Amos knew that face would haunt him for the rest of his life. The detention center of the county jail was radically different from the Richmond Correctional Facility. Amos Kincaid was in a 3-by-4-foot solitary confinement cell with nothing else but a narrow bunk, a sink, and a toilet. The gray concrete walls were hopeless, and the only window under the ceiling let in only a dim light. The first days after his arrest passed like a blur. Amos couldn't believe that Laurel Ransom was dead, and he was accused of her murder. The events on the roof replayed over and over in his mind. The warden's push, his desperate attempt to hold on, his body falling to the pavement. He realized that technically he had indeed pushed her, but it had been self-defense, an attempt to save his own life. On the third day, his court-appointed defense attorney, Daniel Hughes, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a worn briefcase, came to see him. He had been a public defender for 20 years and had seen many difficult cases. "Mr. Kincaid," he said, sitting down across from Amos in the visiting room, "I'll be representing you in court. Tell me what happened on the roof." Amos detailed the events of that day, beginning with Ransom's appearance on the roof and ending with her fall. Hughes listened intently, making notes in his notebook. "You say she tried to push you off the roof first?" the lawyer clarified. "Yes. She grabbed me by my shirt and dragged me to the edge. Said she was going to help me decide to jump." "And the witnesses didn't see that?" "I don't know. There were other inmates, but they all worked at different places. I'm not sure anyone saw the beginning." Hughes nodded and continued to ask about the background of the conflict. Amos recounted months of abuse, systematic beatings, psychological pressure. The lawyer listened with growing interest. "Mr. Kincaid, what you're telling us is very serious. Do you have evidence of this abuse? Medical certificates? Witnesses?" "I tried to complain, but no one would listen. The only person who knows about it is my cellmate Silas Drayton and my psychologist Julianne Flintrow." "Okay." Cell phone rings. "I'll talk to them. What about medical records? Did you go to the prison infirmary?" "A few times when it got really bad, but the doctor just gave me painkillers and let me go." Hughes wrote down the names of potential witnesses and promised a thorough investigation. He knew they had a chance of proving self-defense if they could confirm Ransom's systematic abuse. The following weeks were intense. Hughes met with inmates from the Richmond Correctional Facility, reviewed medical records, and requested service records. Gradually, a picture of what was happening was taking shape. Silas Drayton agreed to testify in favor of Amos, despite the risk to himself. The good-natured crook realized that his testimony could be decisive. "I saw her beat him almost every day," he told his lawyer. "Amos would come into the cell bruised and sometimes barely breathing. I suggested several times that he see a doctor, but he was afraid it would only get worse." Julianne Flintro also agreed to testify, even though it could have hurt her career. The psychologist could no longer remain silent, seeing what her inaction was leading to. "I knew about Mr. Kincaid's problems," she admitted. "I saw the signs of beatings. I noticed his psychological state. I tried to help with official requests, but the administration ignored them." Hughes also found other inmates willing to talk about Ransom's methods. Even those who had previously been afraid to speak now realized that silence could cost the life of an innocent man. A medical examination confirmed the multiple injuries Amos sustained over a long period of time. The expert found fractured fingers, cracked ribs, and extensive hematomas on his back and abdomen, injuries typical of systematic beatings. The trial began 2 months after the tragedy. District Judge Reginald Carter, a 52-year-old man with a reputation for fairness and principle, presided. He was known for not tolerating corruption in law enforcement and always scrutinized cases of abuse of power. The courtroom was full. Representatives of the prison administration, Ransom's colleagues, and journalists from local newspapers were present. The case drew national attention as an example of systemic problems in the state's prison system. County Attorney Patricia Miller represented the prosecution. She was an experienced lawyer, but in this case she had to prove premeditated murder, which proved to be a difficult task. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began her opening statement, "this is a case of murder of a law enforcement officer in the line of duty. The defendant, Amos Kincaid, intentionally pushed Warden Laurel Ransom off the roof of a building, resulting in her death." Attorney Hughes immediately outlined the defense line in his speech. The first to testify were the prosecution witnesses, wardens from the prison who characterized Ransom as a conscientious and professional employee. They claimed that they had never observed any abuse of authority on her part. "Officer Ransom was strict but fair," Captain Brooks testified. "She maintained discipline, but I never saw any unwarranted brutality on her part." On cross-examination, however, Hughes was able to shake this testimony. "Captain Brooks, how often did you personally observe Officer Ransom working with the prisoners?" "Well, I can't say all the time. I have a lot of responsibilities." "So you can't say with certainty what went on between Officer Ransom and the inmates when you weren't around?" "No, I can't." Then the defense witnesses began their testimony. Silas Drayton was called first. Amos's cellmate was nervous, but spoke clearly and convincingly. "I lived with Amos in the same cell for a year and a half. For the last few months, he'd come home from work beaten up almost every day. Bruises, abrasions, sometimes blood. He told me it's Officer Ransom doing it." "Did you see Officer Ransom beat Mr. Kincaid yourself?" Hughes asked. "I did commit a crime," Silas replied calmly. "But I have no reason to lie in this case. I'm just saying what I saw." Julianne Flintro testified next. The psychologist looked tense, realizing that her testimony could cost her her job. "I met with Mr. Kincaid regularly as part of a psychological program. His condition had deteriorated catastrophically in recent months. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and had all the hallmarks of a victim of systematic abuse." "Were you aware that he was being beaten by Officer Ransom?" Hughes asked. "I suspected it." Mr. Kincaid alluded to personnel problems, and the physical injuries spoke for themselves. "Why didn't you take proactive action?" Flintro paused, searching for words. "I tried to help through official channels. I sent requests for Mr. Kincaid's transfer to another unit, but I was denied. The system wasn't interested in solving the problem. The prosecutor attacked this witness as well. Dr. Flintro, if you really knew about the irregularities, why didn't you go directly to the prison director or the prosecutor's office?" "I was afraid," the psychologist admitted honestly. "I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of reprisals. Now I realize that it was a mistake." Then other prisoners spoke. Some told how Ransom had beaten not only Amos, but other prisoners as well. Gradually, a picture of systemic violence in the prison emerged. Inmate Davis, who was working on the roof on the day of the tragedy, gave particularly important testimony. I saw Ransom walk up to Amos and start abusing him. Then she grabbed him and dragged him to the edge of the roof. It looked to me like she wanted to push him off. Did you see the moment that Officer Ransom fell? Yeah. She pushed Amos. He tried to hold on and grabbed onto her. They were both at the edge. Then she lost her balance and fell. The medical examiner gave a detailed report on Amos's injuries. The examination revealed multiple injuries sustained at different times over a period of several months. The nature of the injuries indicated systematic beatings with blunt objects, baton, brass knuckles, rubber tubing. Hughes showed the jury photographs of the injuries, medical reports, and infirmary records. The evidence was overwhelming. In her closing argument, the prosecutor continued to insist that Amos was guilty. Even if Officer Ransom exceeded her authority, that does not justify murder. The defendant could have filed a complaint, contacted other officers, but not pushed a man off the roof. Attorney Hughes parried. My client tried to complain, but the system wouldn't hear him. He was defending his life at a critical moment. Officer Ransom herself created the situation that led to the tragedy. Judge Carter listened carefully to all the testimony and reviewed the evidence presented. In his admonition to the jury, he emphasized, "You must decide whether this was premeditated murder or self-defense in imminent danger of life. Consider all the circumstances of the case, including the background of the relationship between the defendant and the victim." The jury retired to deliberate. Amos waited in his cell, not knowing whether he was facing life in prison or freedom. 4 hours later, the jury returned with a verdict. The foreman stood up and solemnly announced, "Not guilty on the charge of murder in the first degree. On the charge of murder in the second degree, not guilty. Not guilty on the charge of manslaughter." There was an uproar in the courtroom. Amos couldn't believe what he was hearing. Judge Carter restored the silence and addressed the defendant. "Mr. Kincaid, the court finds you not guilty of Officer Ransom's death. Furthermore, given the circumstances of the case and the irregularities in the prison system that have come to light, I am ruling that the remainder of your original sentence be vacated. You are released immediately." Amos Kincaid walked out of the courthouse a free man. After a 1.5 years in prison, months of abuse, and 2 months in a detention center, he could finally breathe. Waiting for him on the courthouse steps was his younger sister Clara, who had traveled to attend the trial. Brother and sister embraced, unable to hide their tears. "It's over," Clara whispered. "Everything will be all right now." Amos nodded, looking up at the blue sky overhead. There was a new life ahead of him, and he was determined to live it well.